Hi girls, in today's lesson we're going to look at the impact of inflation on purchasing power. So in essence what that means is, as you know, goods, things that we buy, groceries, petrol, all of those things inflate every year and they increase in their price. So it means that for each unit of currency you end up getting less and less for what you could buy for that same amount of money. So for example, I'm sure your parents told you that bread cost 2 rand a loaf when they were young and petrol was 2 rand 50 a litre and all those sorts of fairy tales. And in reality, that happens across the board for all different commodities that you buy. So bread costs at the moment maybe about 15 rand a loaf of bread. If it inflates at a certain percentage, next year it could cost 16 rand, etc. So you might have seen in some newspapers, they often show you infographics with how much of a trolley could be filled with 1,000 rand. And over the last kind of 5 years, the amount in the trolley gets lesser and lesser and lesser with 1,000 rand. So in an ideal world, salaries each year would also go up by the same amount, if not more, so that although things are getting more expensive, your salary is increasing at the same rate so that you're actually not affected. In reality, however, salaries generally do lag behind inflation, which means that life gets more and more expensive for people, particularly in a country like ours, where there's a big gap between the rich and the poor, and in developing countries as well. All right, so if you have a look on page 139, there is a worked example that I'm going to work through with you there that talks about basically what could happen if income over a certain amount of years does not increase at the same rate that inflation does. Right, so for question 1 of the worked example, use the information in the table below to determine what a basket of goods worth 1,300 Rand in January 2009 would have cost in January 2011. So that's 2 years later. Okay, so at 2009, that's what it costed in 2009. So in 2010, there's an increase of 6.2%. And then in 2011, there's an increase slightly less at 6.1%. So if we look at the solution, we are increasing the value of 1,300 Rand by 1,081. Now, where that comes from is that it's related to the simple interest formula, but it's calculated like this as well. So let's have a look at number 1. If we say the initial amount was 1,300, and then we add to that 0,081 of 1,300. So that's how you've worked it out in the past. Now, all they've done in their solution there is they've factorized the 1,300 Rand out. So it becomes 1,300, and then open brackets. So 1,300 times 1 will give us that 1,300. And then 1,300, the outside, times the 0,081 will give us this amount. Okay, so there's the 0,081, which then simplifies to 1,300 into 1,081. That's where they get that particular expression from. And then you see that amount works out to 1,405 Rand and 30 cents. That's at the end of 2010. At the end of 2011, we take that amount from the end of 2010 and we work out what the new inflation rate is going to be. So that's 1,062, because that inflation rate is 6,2. And remember that 6,2 would have been 0,062 in here, added to that 1, which then gives you that expression. So in total, after the 2 years, what you could buy for 1,300 Rand in 2009 will now cost you 1,492 Rand 43 cents in 2011. Okay, question 2. Peter earned 10,000 Rand per month in 2009. His salary increased by 700 Rand per month in 2010. Is he better off or worse off in 2010? In other words, would he still be able to afford what he used to be able to afford? Right, so question 2 in the solutions, we see that his salary was 120,000 Rand a year. Okay, because if you earn 10,000 Rand a month, that's 120,000 Rand a year. His salary for 2010 is 10,700 times 12, which is 128,400 per year. So in other words, the percentage increase in his annual salary, we could work this out. Remember, it's new minus old over old times 100 gives us a 7% increase in his salary. All right, so with the percentage increase in his salary, we now need to see that for that year, the average inflation rate was 8.1%. Right, and that 8.1% is higher than the 7% increase that he got, which means that because it's below, his percentage increase in his salary is below the inflation rate of 8.1%, he will be able to afford less and is therefore worse off in 2010 than he was in 2009. Right, question 3. What should Peter earn in 2010 to keep pace with inflation? That means he must earn exactly enough to be able to buy exactly what he could in 2009 in 2010. So all we need to do then is increase his salary by the inflation rate, which is what is done here. So his salary for 2010 is 120,000 into 1,081. Remember, that can be written like this as well. 120,000 plus 0,081 times 120,000, and that'll give you the same answer, okay, which is 129,720. So that's what he would have to earn to be able to have the same purchasing power. Right, question 4. In 2011, his salary is increased to 137,388 per year. Is his salary keeping pace with inflation? Right, so again, in question 4 solutions, we work out what he would need to keep pace with inflation. So his previous salary of 129,720 is increased by the inflation rate of 6.2% to give 137,762. Now he's getting 137,388, which over a year is like a couple of R100 difference. So we can say that it's roughly keeping up with inflation. Okay, next I'm on page 140. We're looking at the inflation and the value of assets over time. So there's a relationship between inflation and a value of assets, which is not always easy to understand, as they say. So the current value of assets such as property, jewelry, cars changes over time in keeping with factors not always related to economic forces and inflation. For example, property tends to appreciate, while most other assets like vehicles and other household goods, appliances, books, all those kinds of things do depreciate, unless they are vintage cars, etc., which is a whole other discussion. So that's why they always say property is a good investment, because property is the one thing that increases in value over time, whereas the car you've bought decreases in value over time. So if you look at the worked example on page 140, the table gives the average inflation rates for South Africa over 3 decades. So the 1980 to 1990 was 14.6%, 1990 to 2000, 9.9, and 2000 to 2010, 7.2. So that also just speaks to what I spoke about in the last video, that the inflation rate has come down since the dawn of democracy in South Africa. Okay, so let's look at these 2 questions. Question 1, Jilma's parents bought a house for 250,000 Rand in 2000. The same house is revalued at 2 million in 2010. The compound rate of appreciation for this house is 23.11% per annum. Is this in keeping with the rate of inflation in that decade? And if not, can you think of reasons for the difference? Okay, so let's look at number 1, the solution. It's not in keeping with the rate of inflation because the rate of inflation was only 7.2%, whereas this has increased by 23.11%. So that's more than triple the rate. And the answer for property is that property inflates at its own rate that is not linked to inflation. Okay, property rates have nothing to do with inflation. Other factors could be the property appreciates. That means it improves in value. Its value increases. It might be because the areas become more popular. They've maybe built some really good schools close by, good shopping centers, those kinds of things. Question 2. Nadia and Eric bought a brand new car in 1980 for 7,000 Rand. They sold this car on the second-hand market in 1990 for 12,000 Rand. So in other words, they're making money off of it. How is this possible if the value of a vehicle depreciates over time? All right, so the simple answer is that although the value of a car depreciates, the purchasing power of money decreases as well. So more money does buy less. Okay, so a simple example is if you had to buy something, I mean, your parents might have bought a car and right back in the 80s, 70s, and they might have spent maybe 3,000-4,000 rand on that car. If that car was still in really good condition now, it could be sold for anything upwards of 20 to 30,000 rand now, if it was in good condition and it was still working. But its real value back in the 80s would have been from 3,000 to 4,000 down to maybe a few hundred rand. So it's important to see that although cars depreciate, purchasing power also gets less and less, so they've got to spend more money to buy something that's actually worth less over a certain amount of time. So question 2.2, the book value of this car in 1990 was listed as 10,000. Did Nadia and Eric make a profit on the sale of this car? Yes, definitely, because they sold it more than what it was worth. All right, girls. Please complete exercise 17 on page 141.